All right. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be going over our economic trends and issues in rural Oklahoma. We like to call this our PowerPoint that gives you a snapshot and a pulse of what all goes on in Oklahoma. It's a great intro to some Oklahoma history as well as just the state as a whole. I'm Laura Brooks. I'm with the Oklahoma Office of Rural Health, and I'll let my colleagues on the call introduce themselves as well.
I'm Mike Woods. I'm a retired professor in the Agricultural Economics Department, OSU.
And I'm Brian Whitaker. I'm a current professor in the Agricultural Economics Department here in Stillwater.
All right, well, let's get started. This is just an outline of our presentation. We'll start off talking about population trends in Oklahoma. It's a mixed bag. Some places are growing, some places are declining. But just overall, what does that look like? Stress counties in the plains, metro growth versus non-metro growth here in Oklahoma, employment opportunities, entrepreneurship, cultural change and diversity, health indicators and outcomes, broadband adoption and availability, and then looking towards the future. And so just a little background about our data that we use, a little bit of data discussion. We rely heavily on census data. In particular, the decennial census is it's a very unique and very, it's a survey that we really depend heavily upon. It's one of the largest sample size surveys administered, so therefore there's not a margin of error. The sample, the number of surveys they get back is large enough that there is no margin of error. Most other surveys that we use in research, we will see a confidence interval or a margin of error for the values included. The decennial census is every 10 years. And if you recall, ours landed in 2020. When you do the decennial census, it's your population as of April 1 of that year. April 1 of 2020 was an interesting time for all of us. And so with that said, there have been delays in some of the data coming out. We're excited we do have some county level data to share, but there are delays. There are many other programs throughout the country that rely on the decennial census data. In particular, the USDA Economic Research Service utilizes the data. With that said, in the coming years, you'll see some updated definitions, some updated other data that relies on the census. So 2020 is the most current, but what's going to happen until 2030? In between, we're able to use American Community Survey data. This is also administered through the census every year. However, it's a smaller sample size, and so you will see a margin of error when utilizing that data. One thing to note, in 2010, the census made the switch from using the long survey on the decennial census to using the short survey. So the long survey that includes education and income data is now administered through the American Community Survey. Also, in between years, we're able to get population estimates. And so there's some data gathering, but also a little bit of forecasting that goes into looking at county level, place level, as well as state level population estimates. And then lastly, a couple other sources that we rely heavily on, the Bureau of Economic Analysis. When I do this presentation in communities, I like to say, if you want to know anything about income, gross domestic product, that is your place to go. This data, they're updated annually. So the 2021 data, we're about a 2-year lag, but the 2021 data should be released later this year, probably November, December 2022. Also, the Bureau of Labor Statistics is the go-to source for employment and unemployment data. We're able to get annual data as well as county level data we're able to get county level data and monthly estimates throughout the year. And so those are two of our other really good national sources to go to. So with that said, I will turn it over to Dr. Woods.
Thanks, Laura. As she said, the first section talks about population trends in Oklahoma, and certainly we do see a mixed bag. Oklahoma's census population increased by 5.5% from 2010 to the census year 2020, roughly a net gain of 208,000 individuals. At the same time, the U.S. population increased by 7.4%. Therefore, Oklahoma did not regain a representative to the House in 2020. It's interesting to note that 50 of Oklahoma's 77 counties, almost 2/3, actually experienced a decline in population from 2010 to 2020. And in fact, almost 1/2 of Oklahoma's residents reside in only 4 counties. Those counties are listed: Canadian, Cleveland, Oklahoma, and Tulsa. Next slide. This is a map, a national map that looks at the percent change in population from 2010 to 2020. So you can see how Oklahoma fares compared to our neighbors. We did grow faster than our neighbor to the north, Kansas, as you see here. However, we did not grow quite so fast as Texas. You see the larger population percentage growth tended to occur in the west and the southeast, as well as Texas. Those 3 counties that are tan those 3 states that are tan are actually states which declined in population. I believe that is Mississippi, Illinois, and West Virginia. Next slide, please. Another national map here presenting data for the 2020 census, comparing it to 2010 by county. If you see counties that are the tan or the golden color, those are counties that experience population decline. The key takeaway here, going from the Texas Panhandle, the Oklahoma Panhandle, all the way north to North Dakota, you're going to see a lot of tan counties, or counties that lost population. This occurred, in fact, throughout the Midwest and around the country. So the phenomenon we see in Oklahoma with our rural counties declining in population is not solely confined to Oklahoma, but actually we see it occurring around the country. Next slide. This is a state map, again, breaking out our counties so you can see population growth from 2010 to 2020 by county. And the numbering there from 1 through 10 shows you the counties that had the largest population growth. They're shaded in dark blue. They tended to congregate around Oklahoma City, Oklahoma County, and also Tulsa County. You also see Bryan and Love County had some very large percentage population growth, and they're feeling the impacts of the Dallas metro. The deep dark purple are counties that lost, in fact, even more than 9%. So it gives you a picture of what's going on. Next slide, please. As we have said, these numbers lead to some stressed counties in the plains regions, not only of Oklahoma, but also the country. Many of these counties actually peaked in population prior to 1940. In fact, for a few counties, the population density, or population per square mile, is so low that the county meets a criterion 19th century definition of a frontier county. Historically, these counties have occurred where there's an agricultural base. Next slide, please. I love this map that Laura developed. It breaks down county population and identifies the census year that the county had the largest population on record. We went all the way back to 1910, brought it forward through the census year 2020, and identified the census year when that county had the largest population. What you see with those pink counties, Harper County, Woods County, and across the northern tier of our state, those are counties that had the largest population on their record in 1910, more than 100 years ago. Tells you that there's not been a lot of population growth in those counties for the last century. The counties that are deep dark blue or purple are counties that registered their largest population either in 2010 or 2020. This is a really interesting slide, and it probably tells you a little bit about the history of our state, how our state was settled. There's probably a little land run influence here, as well as the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl influencing our population. Next slide, please. This is an additional slide that was developed by Dr. Andrew Van Leuven, who is a faculty member in the Agricultural Economics Department at OSU, and it uses that same data from 1910 to 1920 and presents you a graphic picture. You see those counties that are shaded gray. Those are counties that had their peak population back in 1910, 1920. And so you can see the gray counties experiencing not very much population growth, but the tan counties with the large peaks, those are counties that have tended to have population growth in 2010, 2020, that is the largest on record. Great slide to give you another pictorial view of our state's population history. Next slide, please. And this is a state level map that breaks down counties by population density, as I said, population per square mile. The blue counties are counties that have less than 6 people per square mile in those counties. So technically they're defined as a frontier county. The 2 red counties, Oklahoma County, Tulsa County, have population density at greater than 1,000 per square mile. So quite a big difference there. Big takeaway here. If you're in a county with low population density, the cost per person to provide services, water, electricity, education, and certainly broadband is extremely high because there's fewer people to spread that cost across. And so that can be a real challenge for developing rural Oklahoma. Next slide, please. We like to talk about metropolitan growth and compare that to non-metropolitan growth. The trend is for there to be greater metropolitan population nationwide, and that is occurring in Oklahoma. Currently, 67% of our population lives in a metropolitan county. You see the definition there. To be a metropolitan county, you've got to have a core city of at least 50,000 or greater. And those core cities that we see showing up and influencing us in Oklahoma, Enid, Lawton, Oklahoma City, Tulsa, and even Fort Smith, Arkansas. There's another definition called micropolitan, which focuses on core cities of 10,000 or greater. And you can say those are counties that are maybe trying to become metropolitan, but are not quite there yet. Next slide. And this is a statewide map, which just tells you which counties are metropolitan, which counties are non-metropolitan. The green counties are our metropolitan counties with about 65% of our total population. The blue counties are those micropolitan counties that are not quite there yet. And then if you're white, you're definitely a county that is classified as non-metropolitan. Next slide. And this is a nationwide map that shows the percentage of the people in a state that live in non-metropolitan areas. In Oklahoma, you're going to see that number in the green shaded region coming in at 33.2%. Now, that's greater than our neighbor to the south, Texas, which only has about 11% of its total population living in non-metropolitan areas. And you can look up to the north, Montana, Wyoming, a few of those states where 50% or more of the population lives in non-metropolitan areas. And so it gives you some perspective for our state of Oklahoma and where we fall. Next slide. And this is a chart that presents the history of non-metropolitan and metropolitan population in the state of Oklahoma since 1980. You can see in 1980, 59% of our total population lived in metropolitan areas. By 2020, that had grown to 67%. And so there's this natural trend from decade to decade, and we are becoming, in fact, more metropolitan, more urban. However, a takeaway here, 67% of our population lives in metropolitan areas. That's compared to the nationwide average of 86%. So Oklahoma still would be considered somewhat a rural and non-metropolitan state. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Wood. So Mike just spent some time talking to you guys about population, and we saw this increasing trend in metro areas of Oklahoma. But now I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit more about employment levels. And that's clearly something of interest to a lot of our cities and counties. When we go out and talk to leadership in individual counties, they're certainly concerned about having jobs available for the youth of today, what's going to happen as the workforce ages, how they can expand their current job opportunities that they have there. And so I'm going to walk through some slides that kind of show you the employment situation across the state. Next slide, please. And so this shows the in percentage employment growth between 2001 and 2020. And kind of the striking thing here is that a lot of our counties had higher employment 20 years ago than they do now. And you might have kind of look at the earlier map that we saw, and a lot of these counties that have lost employment are the same ones that are losing population. So you can see the negative growth out in most of the panhandle counties, and in a lot of the both southeastern and southwestern counties. And so the other thing that stands out to me on this map is if you look at the places that have really grown in employment, you see the suburbs around the Oklahoma City area. And then also you see down there in Bryan and Love County. And again, that ties in with what Dr. Wood showed you with the growth, a lot of it coming from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, not just in population, but also in employment. So a lot of our, as we said earlier, rural counties are kind of struggling to keep and create jobs. And this map just kind of drives that home. Next slide. This map shows, or this chart shows us the unemployment rates between 1990 and 2020. And the thing that stands out to me here is, if you look really across all of Oklahoma's history, the unemployment rates in non-metro areas, the more rural areas, really were higher than metro areas. And it's kind of striking to me to look at the trends in unemployment leading up to the 2008 recession. If you guys remember, we had the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. And those trends kind of started to merge there. But you see, non-metro was much higher back in the 90s, and then they started to merge around 2008, 2009. But then once we hit that Great Recession, we once again saw the non-metro areas fare worse. And that continued. We again saw kind of this merging pattern between, as we recovered from the Great Recession, non-metro again higher than metro until we hit the COVID-19 recession. You can see that happen there in 2020. And as we all know, as when COVID-19 hit, that actually hit metro areas a little bit harder. They had more restrictions in place, more businesses that were forced to shut down. And so you see the unemployment rate a little bit higher in metro areas. And we'll kind of see how, if we return to prior trends of having unemployment a bit higher in non-metro areas, or if this would be kind of a new normal for us. Next slide. So we're going to talk about this. This shows really kind of an overall picture of how Oklahoma compares to the rest of the country. And the striking thing here is we're doing really well in terms of unemployment rate. You see a lot of our counties have unemployment rates that are less than half of the national average. You see the statistics there on the left. The 2021 U.S. unemployment rate was over 5%. Here in Oklahoma, it was less than 4%. We only have a couple of counties that were greater than the national average for 2021, and most of our counties were less than 75%, even less than 50% of that. So, half of a 5.3 average is, 2.5% unemployment, which is strikingly low. So we're doing relatively well compared to the rest of the country. Next slide. Here's some county typology codes, and these were done as of 2015, which is important. And I'll talk about this here in a second. You can see this kind of shows the specialty of what a lot of economic activity is happening in some of our counties across the state. And so we've got a few more slides here that we'll run through. You can see a lot of them in this chart appear to be mining focused, and then there's also a lot of farming dependent categories. But I'm going to go through these kind of one by one and talk to you about the definitions and how they kind of appear. So go ahead and go to the next one, Laura. So this is farming dependent categories. And you can see down there at the bottom, the definition is that the activity of farming accounted for at least 25% of the earnings or 16% of the employment. And that's going to change based on the categories we're talking about. Those thresholds shift based on when they do this. But it's also important here is the years. So they use data from 2010 to 2012 to get this definition of a farming dependent county. And I don't think these have changed a lot since that time frame for farming dependent, but some of these other ones we're going to talk about later certainly have. So the key takeaway here is about a quarter of all of Oklahoma counties are classified as farming dependent. You can see a lot out in the western part of the state are classified as farming dependent. We've kind of gotten away from defining all rural counties as agriculture only. There's a lot of other activities that are going on in these counties and cities, but we still do have a dominant farming sector in at least a decent amount of our counties. Next slide. So here's the one that I think is really going to change. And if you look at this was a mining dependent counties as of 2015. And looking down there at the bottom, again, this was data from 2010 through 2012. And if you guys remember what was happening in the 2010 to 12 time period, this was really when the fracking boom was almost at its peak. It kind of peaked around the 13, 14 area. And then since that, so really what this represents is there was a lot of fracking activity, a lot of oil and gas development in all these counties during that time. There was a lot of activity going on. We had wells being drilled all over the place. And a lot of these counties had above average levels of employment or earnings in those regions. But since that kind of 2014 bust, when we saw the oil prices drop and oil activity kind of go away, I don't think we're going to see nearly this many mining dependent counties when they redo this, and we should be getting another one here in 2025, which sadly is not too far away. And they'll be using the 2020 to 2012 data to kind of redo this, and I don't think we're going to see nearly as many mining dependent counties in that next update. Next slide. We also have manufacturing dependent counties. These might not surprise a lot of you guys to see these. You can certainly pick out a couple of manufacturing dominant companies in some of these counties. So out in Texas, of course, we have Seaboard. In Noble, of course, we have Ditch Witch, and there's some kind of plastics manufacturers out in Mays County. In Pryor in particular, they have DuPont and some other plastics oriented manufacturers. So just a few where the employment or earnings in manufacturing was significantly above the kind of national threshold that you see down there at the bottom. Okay, so that's manufacturing. Next slide. And here are our government dependent counties. You see a lot of kind of smaller rural counties that, along with others like Payne and Comanche, where the government employer in that county is a dominant force. So here in Payne County, where I'm sitting, of course, that includes OSU. We are a large employer and classified as a government employer there. Of course, Jackson, you see, we know the Air Force Base out in Altus, and of course, Lawton is home to Fort Sill. And then you can see some of the other government dependent counties down there. Ada, I think that's in Pittsburgh County, or McAllister, I should say. They're the jail in McAllister is a large employer, and you can kind of see a few other ones across the state that are heavily dependent on government employment. Next slide. This is a cool one, the recreation dependent counties. And I always show this map to my class and ask them what is unique about these three counties, and they pick up on it pretty quick. So you guys probably are aware that these three counties have lakes very close by, and that's why people head there for the recreation associated with those lakes. Of course, in Delaware, we have Grand Lake is near there, McIntosh is Lake Eufaula, and then Marshall is Lake Texoma. And so those are the reasons why these are typically classified as recreation dependent. A lot of the activity in those counties is driven by recreation associated with the lake. Next slide. Okay. Is that me, Laura, or is this you?
It's me, sorry. So I'm covering the category of entrepreneurship. And so this has been something that I know Dr. Woods and I've worked on for many years, really focusing on our rural entrepreneurs and talking about strategies and resources to support those individuals. Small entrepreneurs really enhance the quality of life of a region. They're when they're summed up, can be large employers of communities, and then also new technologies can contribute considerably to a region's economic prosperity. Overall, just really do good things for their communities where they're located. So the next two slides we derived from a Main Street Economist article several years ago, completed by the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank. And so we took their methodology and we've modified it and updated it every year for Oklahoma, just to see our breadth of entrepreneurship followed by our depth of entrepreneurship. So this first slide here is our breadth of entrepreneurship. It's this share of self-employment. When you're looking at the Bureau of Economic Analysis data, it's your non-farm proprietors in relation to total employment for Oklahoma counties. And so our green counties, so all of our yellow counties are less than the Oklahoma average. Green counties are higher and red counties are substantially higher. Unfortunately, we're not able to dive down to see exactly what those industries or companies they own are. We're just able to see that they're non-farm proprietors. The next step is looking at the depth of entrepreneurship per community. And so this slide here is the average entrepreneur non-farm proprietor income for Oklahoma counties. The yellow counties are less than $25,000. The green counties are $25,000 to $47,771, which is the Oklahoma average. The red counties are all higher than the Oklahoma average. So when you compare these two slides, we see first, there are quite a few self-employed individuals, non-farm proprietors, but when we look at the depth, when we look at the income, it's not as high. Some counties, we do have some really standout high incomes, but other counties, we do not. And the next few slides we have here, cultural changes and diversity. Oklahoma is really diverse. I always like to say I-35 kind of divides Oklahoma north and south, but also we see trends, how the state was settled and just trends overall. We do a lot of community health needs assessments throughout the state, and we talk about race and age data. Western Oklahoma tends to see a larger Hispanic origin population, which is really important to be aware of who lives in our communities. We've worked in communities in the past where they've identified, not only do we want translation services at the hospital, but we want that person where English is their second language and they go into the community to provide education, provide services. Eastern Oklahoma, we tend to see a larger Native American population, which from my perspective in healthcare, we see the same patients and how can we work together to make sure we're benefiting those patients. So those are kind of the perspectives we take on looking at these populations. So this is the Hispanic origin population as a share of total county population for 2020. Western Oklahoma, like I mentioned, we tend to see a larger Hispanic origin population. That's not necessarily the case in Eastern Oklahoma. The state rates about 11% total population is identified as Hispanic origin. Native American share of the population, Eastern Oklahoma, like I mentioned, we tend to see a larger share with the exception of Caddo County, who is home to many tribal nations there, headquartered in Caddo County and in particular Anadarko. Next, we get into some of the health indicators and outcomes that we share through our community health needs assessments. And so rather than going through the list here, I'll just show you the slides. This first slide here is the share of population under the age of 65 who is captured as uninsured. This comes from the census. And so it's really important to know who the census captures as insured. So insured is anyone with insurance through your employer, previous employer, Medicare, Medicaid, VA. If you're Native American and rely solely on Indian health services or tribal benefits, the census captures that population as uninsured. And so we like to share this definition because it does have implications for Oklahoma. If you think back to when the Affordable Care Act was passed and there was the insurance requirement in there, that was actually one of the exemptions is if you had access to care through tribal benefits or IHS was nearby, you were exempt. And so we like to share this, explain the definition because some places it might not actually be as high. People might actually have access to care because we have great tribal and Indian health services throughout our state. Next, we have the poverty rate by county, and the next slide explains kind of the stair step by household and income of the poverty rate. You can see Northwest Oklahoma tends to fare better than some of our other counties. Southern and Southeastern Oklahoma, we tend to see a larger poverty rate. In this slide here, when we do our meetings, I like to explain that it's not just a single line for the poverty threshold. It's not just a single dollar amount. It's based on your household size. And then you see a stair step of the dollar amount based on how many folks are in your household, related children under the age of 18 per household. Next, food insecurity. This is the share of the population who lack adequate access to food. This is overall how it's calculated. It's an econometric model where they're estimating income, essentially who potentially ran out of money to buy food in the previous year. And so you can see the higher the rate, the more red the shade. And so you can see a few counties in Southwest Oklahoma, but several counties in Southeastern Oklahoma, we see a higher rate of food insecurity. The green counties, some of the Panhandle and Northwest Oklahoma tend to fare a little bit better. We rely heavily on county health rankings data with what we do. They do not do any surveying of their own, but instead they gather data that are already out there. They rank each measure on two overall measures. So they rank each county within each state on two overall measures. The first is health outcomes. That is, what does the health of our residents look like today? Health factors is the other measure. It is, what are we doing, what's available to us today to determine tomorrow's health? And so you can see how those are weighted and how they break down. So health outcomes, today's health is made up of length of life and quality of life. health factors. You can see our categories here. And I will point out social and economic factors accounts for the largest share. This is largely due to social determinants of health. And so here are what our maps look like. So this is health factors. What does tomorrow's health look like? You can really see those social and economic factors come out in this map. If you recall previous slides, if we put the uninsured, or not the uninsured, but the unemployment map over this one, it would look pretty similar. And so we see those social and economic factors really come out. This is health outcomes. So what does today's health look like of our residents? It's somewhat similar, but we do have some counties in Western Oklahoma, in particular Blaine and Caddo County, who are shaded a little bit less favorable. And then lastly, I just like to throw this slide in here because this isn't necessarily part of the measures, but it's one that everyone's really interested in. People are always really curious, what does life expectancy look like in my home county? And so you can see the breakdown. The green counties are the more favorable. The dark maroon counties have the lower years, the less favorable years. So Dr. Whitaker, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Laura. We're going to talk now about broadband access, which is always a hot topic. And in particular, we just had an infrastructure act that was passed that put a lot of money towards this. And so I'm going to go over some data that shows you what it looks like across the state. Whenever we talk broadband, I always differentiate between the simple availability of broadband, which means you have a company providing service to your household where you could buy it if you wanted to, and the adoption of broadband, which means you actually do pay for a monthly connection and have a regular internet connection available to you that you use regularly. And so we're going to talk about both the availability of it, and you'll see in some counties it's just not available. Even if you wanted to pay for it, you couldn't pay for it. And adoption. So you can see kind of some highlights here. 11 counties you'll see not very good broadband availability, and the average connection, about 83% of our households have a connection at their house. So next slide. So this is the adoption, or I'm sorry, the availability piece. This is where companies go and offer broadband. And you can see, unfortunately, this data is a little bit dated. We only have it from December 2019. We're actually just now getting our hands on the 2020 data. And so even though there's a lot of work being done right now in trying to get broadband out to more rural parts of the state, but we just don't have that data ready to use at this point. And so what this map shows us is, as of 2019, the official definition of broadband, you can see there in the title, is this 25/3, which means 25 megabits per second download. So if you're downloading Netflix or a lot of pictures or something like that, and 3 megabits per second upload, which means if you're putting up YouTube videos or whatever the case is, that's the official definition. And so this is the percentage of households that have a broadband connection available to them where they live. And you can see we have 11 counties with less than half of our households that have that. They could buy that even if they wanted to. And so not great. You can see a lot of the more urban areas, if you again look and kind of hone in on Oklahoma City and Tulsa, Comanche County, even Payne County, the numbers are closer to, in the 90s, if not close to 100. So really good broadband availability there. In our more rural parts of the state, we just don't have that availability. Next slide. So that was the availability question. Here's the adoption question. How many households actually pay for some type of internet connection? And this correlates highly with, as Laura said, kind of the poverty and unemployment rates. The reason is, if you're an impoverished household and you're unemployed household, there's a likelihood you just can't afford to pay for a monthly broadband connection. You can see in the Southeast, we have less than 65% of the households that pay for a monthly connection to the internet. And the reason why this is important, we know now that having that regular connection is important for a whole host of economic outcomes, for raising income levels, for improving education levels, for generating employment opportunities. It's really pretty well established now that broadband really does matter for economic outcomes. And so if you're not taking advantage of that, you really are at a disadvantage. And so this kind of shows that you can see the state average is about 84%, but we really only have a couple of counties that are significantly above that. Again, those tend to be in the kind of suburbs of the major metros, and a lot of our counties are really again kind of disadvantaged in terms of having an internet connection at home. So this was some type of internet access, and I'll ask Laura to go over to the next slide, because this next one is a specific type of connection, and that is a mobile only connection. So those of you like me that never go anywhere without this smartphone attached to you, some people, this is the only way that they get on the internet. You can see here, I've highlighted, the map highlights some counties where really there's a high dependency on a mobile phone as their form of internet connection. And while they are great, they're not great for everything. So think about trying to make a resume on a smartphone, or interact with a government agency on a smartphone. Not always the easiest to do. Filling out forms is not always easy to do on a smartphone. Running a small business, not easy to do on a smartphone. So we try to emphasize for people to use an array of connections, and this is kind of seen as a lower tier type of connections. We have a lot of households that are really almost overly dependent on a mobile only connection. That's what this map shows. Next slide. We also have households that are dependent on satellite connections, and for those of you with a satellite connection, you know that they're not always reliable. In some cases, that the reason you're stuck with the satellite connection is because there's no good provider near your house, and so you can, for most parts of our state, you can get a satellite connection if you wanted to. They are more expensive and also less reliable. So this is kind of again seen as kind of a lower tier type of connection, and we have quite a few of our counties where there's an over dependence on that, if you will. Next slide. Okay, so let's go to the last section, I think, here, and talk about some the future of rural Oklahoma. You can see the topics that we're going to briefly touch on. And so these are obviously important for Oklahoma and rural parts of Oklahoma in particular. So I'll briefly go through these topics, and then we'll kind of wrap things up. So next slide, Laura. So this shows the Cushing spot price in terms of dollars per barrel of oil. And you can see here this only goes through 2020. And of course, we're sitting in a period of hugely high inflation right now. I actually just looked this up prior to our starting this video. And I think the dollar per barrel right now is over 100. And so it has significantly taken off since that 2020 or mid 2020 data we have. It's approaching, I think it maybe past the peaks that we saw in the 2010, 2012 timeframe when the oil activity was high here in Oklahoma. And so oil is going to continue to be an important part of Oklahoma's economy. We'll have to see how this inflation thing plays out. We're talking about buying gas, and it's costing you, $100 a tank. And so that's going to certainly put a crimp on a lot of people's economic activity. Next slide. And so here is the mining percent of total employment. And again, the numbers are the top 5 percentages of employment in mining as of 2020. It looks a pretty decent amount different than, if you remember, that mining dependent category that we had from the 2010 to 2012 timeframe. You can see here we still have a few counties where the percentage employment in mining is greater than 12, but it's not nearly as high as it was back in that kind of fracking boom that we mentioned earlier. So again, mining is going to be an important part of the state's economy, but probably not to the tune it was when the fracking boom was dominant 10 or so years ago. Next slide. Okay, let's talk about a little bit more pure ag. Wheat is obviously one of Oklahoma's biggest commodities. This data is as of 2020. You can see here the 5 counties that have greater than 5 million bushels of wheat that were produced in 2020. And we have quite a few counties. Again, most of this is geared towards the western half of the state with over 2 million bushels of wheat. I also quickly looked this up in 2022, and things are not looking good. I think I saw that the projection was for less than half of the 2021 wheat production was actually going to be captured this year. And so it's a rough time for farmers out there. We're probably not going to see as great economic impact of the wheat in a lot of these western counties that are dependent on that kind of production. But again, we know wheat is important. We're going to continue to follow it. And the clear takeaway here is that a lot of these counties that are dependent on wheat are going to be struggling as the wheat production is declines this year. Next slide. Another important ag commodity is cotton, and you can see here this is the cotton bales produced per county. We have a couple down there in in the southwest corner that have quite a few cotton bales produced. And if you think about what's there in Tillman and Harmon counties, those are pretty rural counties. I know maybe 5,000 total people in the entire county, and they produce a lot of cotton. And so they're very, very much dependent on that. Again, most of this activity is geared towards the west, so that will continue to be an important commodity for a lot of these counties that you see here. Next slide. Let's go to cattle, which we know is, again, important. The huge one here, Texas County, of course, with a lot of this is both cattle and calves. And so while this does, you can see that it's kind of mostly skewed towards the western part of the state. We have quite a bit of cattle, but in Osage and Craig County in the east. And so that's an interesting takeaway. Both of those rank in the top 5 in terms of a number of cattle. And so while cattle is not huge all across the state, we do have a couple of counties that are relatively dependent on it, and that will continue to be an important part for those counties. Next slide. This is a fun one. It looks at the number of cattle per person in all these counties across the state. And the fun outlier there is Cimarron County, where they have 40 times as many cattle as they do people. So that's kind of a neat takeaway. Again, this is skewed a little bit towards the western part of the state. You can see in a lot of the eastern counties, we have less than 1 cow per person, and we're just a little bit over 1. But certainly an outlier there in Cimarron. There's a lot of cattle and not too many people in Cimarron County, and so that will be a trend to keep an eye on. Next slide. Hogs and pigs. Not as much of an economic dependency for most of our counties, but you can see a couple of counties where that obviously is an important thing. Of course, we have Seaboard in Texas County there in Guyman. And so a lot of hog inventory that are being processed in Guyman. Also quite a bit in Hughes County. So there's a decent amount. And again, some of those counties surrounding Oklahoma City to the east have a decent amount of hog inventory as well. Next slide. Poultry, this is an interesting one because it shifts away from the west. We don't have a whole lot of poultry inventory in the western part of the state, and we do on the east. And you can see there quite a bit of poultry, greater than 100,000 in several of our counties that border Arkansas. And so there is a lot of activity, and there's a lot of issues with poultry waste management that we have people working on. But again, this is an important economic contributor for the people working in ag on these eastern counties. And next slide. And then, of course, we have the drought. So you can see this is actually the most recent drought monitor that we have as of May 17th. And we were just joking around before this video. It looks a lot better than it did, 2 weeks before this. And the late April one had a lot more red and a lot more dark red, maroon color. And actually, if you look at Oklahoma compared to some of our neighboring states, it's really not as bad. A lot of Texas is really struggling with drought. You can see there that the category D4, which is exceptional drought. A lot of the Texas panhandle is covered in that very dark maroon color. Of course, it's clearly bad in the panhandle in the southwestern parts of our state, not so much in the east, but this is something that's been a trend for really the past decade. We're going to have to continue to keep an eye on it because it has implications for all of our ag products. And so we certainly need to keep an eye on that, and something we'll be monitoring in the future. And next slide. And so I think that does it. We just want to turn it, make sure you guys are aware of some of the resources that we have. Of course, here at OSU, we have our rural development website, and you can see some of the things that we offer on that site. We have a couple people like me working in community economic development. We are pretty good at using the Census 2020 data. So you can reach out to me or Laura, and we can help you with gather some of that 2020 data. We also had a couple slides in here from Dr. Andrew Van Leuven, who's our new guy on faculty here in the rural development portion of Ag Econ, and we can certainly happy to help you guys pull some of that data and see what your local situation is right. And then Laura, I don't know if you want to talk about your the OSU Rural Health blog and where this might be available.
Sure. We have a blog where we post all of our videos as well as our maps and just interesting rural health items. We also created a YouTube channel a couple of years ago, and that's where we house all of our webinars. So we have a variety of webinars. We have quality webinars, swing bed, as well as CEO and CFO specific topics. We also, as I mentioned, complete several community health needs assessments. All of those reports are posted to our blog as well. And then also for further questions, please feel free to reach out to us. And I apologize, Dr. Whitaker, I failed to get your email address on here, but I promise you, if anyone reaches out to me, I'll forward them to you.
We'll send everybody to Andrew. That's okay. That's good. That's good with me. No, of course, happy to help. And Laura is a great resource, as is Dr. Woods. And both Andrew and I can certainly help you guys get questions about your county or your city in particular.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.